they've done a good job. They've actually done all the things necessary to reduce the number of temporary residents. And in fact, they're going to go too far, and they have gone too far. And so we've got certain areas of the immigration system now that are suffering badly. Entrepreneurs. If you can imagine, people come to Canada, they come with money, they start a business, they invest in that business, they hire Canadians, small entrepreneurs, which are the heart and soul of our employment structure.
Yep.
Many of them for the last 2 years have had no path to permanent residence at all.
Hi, this is TPLMedia.ca. I am Bradie Whetham, and today we are talking about one of these subjects that I know seems to be in a category that people are very hesitant to talk about, but I do have one of the most knowledgeable people in that actual category today with me to talk about immigration, Phil Mooney. Phil, how are you today?
Doing just great. Thank you very much.
So before we got the show started, I was telling you that my knowledge on immigration really isn't that vast. What I know about immigration is pretty much what I've learned from these interviews, not only with the fellas sitting down with you and Nir Rosenberg. And I suggest anybody watching go back and watch some of that. A lot of clarification on the process and how it works. But what would an average Canadian like myself need to know about immigration before we start this off and we start getting into some of the points and the changes over the past couple months? But what would a gentleman like me need to know about immigration to fully try and understand what it is?
Okay, well, a couple of things. This subject of immigration, everyone in Canada has an opinion. Everyone has some experience with it. The key things to understand are that fundamentally immigration is based on law, that there are laws and regulations and policies that fundamentally guide the immigration system and the people who work in it and affect everyone who's trying to come to Canada. Okay, so that the legal system and part of this is very good. And sometimes the law makes no sense at all. Okay, so what you might think should happen isn't what happens. It's the same thing as going to court for any other court process, and the judge and the lawyers know they make rules or they make decisions and it affects the outcome, but you don't understand why, because you can't understand everything about the law. But just like the weather, where we all have an opinion about it and we all talk about it, unless you're a meteorologist, you can't really understand a lot of the things about the weather. Immigration is somewhat like that. The other part that makes this so confusing is that almost all of us have an immigration story. We either are immigrants, we've come to Canada, we're children of immigrants, we're knowledgeable of and friendly of immigrants, and we all hear stories. And many of those stories are true, but they're, for a whole lot of them, because they happened more than, say, 5 years ago, they actually don't help you understand the system, because the system has been changing. So if you keep all that in mind, I think the best thing I can say is approach any immigration topic with some humility, knowing that there are nuances and details that may affect this story, that unless you listen a lot and learn from them, you won't, it doesn't make sense to form opinions unless you have some factual basis. Okay.
Well, and I think I'm the perfect guy to sit down and talk to you, because I really don't have any opinions, because with what you just said, and that kind of clarifies my own thoughts, or I don't know enough about this to form that kind of an opinion. That's like saying I'm going to complain about the government while I don't vote.
Yeah, exactly. Now there is a benefit to be said that if you don't know enough to vote, you shouldn't vote. I know everyone wants to talk about participation in elections. Oh, sorry, it's a political point. But why do you want an 18 or 19-year-old to affect who's in Parliament when they don't understand anything about it? Mm-hmm. Okay, so there should be a knowledge test before anybody votes. Otherwise, what you get are basically fandom. Okay, which we get a lot in elections, but that's a different issue. So,
we've seen that a little bit in Canada, but yeah, we'll leave that to the side.
All right. So, with regards to immigration, the history of this and the big picture is really important. It's important to know that until 30 years ago, immigration was looked upon as completely favorable, because there was not a great demand for Canadian immigration, if you want to know. Canadian immigration officers used to go out to recruit people to come to Canada. My father-in-law came from Germany in the early 50s because Canada needed mechanics. So they sent immigration officers outside Canada to bring them here. And that happened with many countries. It was also quite restrictive in the sense that it only allowed people from white Northern European countries effectively to come here, or from the United States. And it wasn't until the 70s when that changed under Pierre Trudeau, when basically immigration became completely and totally colorblind and ethnic blind. Okay, and it just said people are coming here, not people from somewhere. At the same time, there wasn't a great demand for immigration until the age of the internet. Okay, because most people wouldn't have imagined coming to Canada except as on a holiday unless they were educated and had access to news media and access to information sources like television and radio, et cetera, that they could understand something about Canada. And it wasn't until the internet and that individuals could go online and see that Canadian immigration was indeed colorblind, if you will. And so information about Canada became far more widely available after 2000. And coincidentally, in 2002, the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act came into force in June of that year, which was the first change in really the process of immigration since the 70s, and was the first change after everyone all of a sudden became on what was going online and started to understand and made what's made accessible. And at the time, the immigration goals for Canada, the target for immigration was split into basically three main areas. There was a compassionate policy for refugees, which has been part of Canada's immigration since the 50s, where we were accepting people from specific countries fleeing war and terror. And so that's always been part of our system, but it's a small part. It's anywhere from between 5 and 10% of our total immigration intake. There's family reunification. We've always believed that parents and children should be together, that husbands and wives should be together, that we shouldn't make an impediment to those people being together if one part of them were in Canada and other parts weren't. And there was a room for some parents and grandparents. At one time in the early 90s, we allowed brothers and sisters to sponsor, but the demand outstripped the need or the capacity really fast. So that was only good for a year or two.
Oh, really?
Yeah, the U.S. still has it, but they have a different way of controlling their intake. So in the early 2000s, intake all of a sudden was based on refugees, family, and then economic class, because by then people were starting to realize that with the birth rate dropping, we had a demographic problem.
I don't mean to cut you off, but I was actually going to ask you about that. So I did an episode a few weeks ago with Liam DeBoer and Jim Lang, who are very educated in that topic. And one of the things that I did kind of get from it was that the UN really did stress this about 10, 15 years ago, that Canada's birth rate was declining fast. And one of the ways that they could try to counterbalance that was immigration.
Exactly. And the method has somewhat, or the message has somewhat changed over the years. In the 70s and 80s and 90s, years I grew up in, the baby boomers were the big generation, but they were the money generating generation. They were the workers. They were, the savers. They were the funders of the massive capital expansion in the 90s and 2000s. But demographics people weren't really paying much attention. And you heard about Japan, where all of a sudden the people were getting older and there weren't enough young people, but it was kind of like, it became more of a place of mind in the 2000s as the one thing you can understand is you're gonna know how many 20-year-olds you're gonna have because they were born in 20 years ago. You can't argue with demographics. Only massive famine or disasters can change the world's demographic picture, and most countries in the world were in a positive demographic mode. And only the repercussions that started happening in Japan in the 90s and 2000s started to say, wait a minute, what if we don't have enough young people to pay for the old people? And from about 2010 on, the message sort of was coming out saying, well, immigration can't cure demographics. Strangely enough, that's changed in the 2020s, where Canada became one of the first examples of a country that was adjusting to the demographic problems because of the policies they enacted in 2000. Mm-hmm. And so the economic policies that we adopted in 2000 under the IRPA said we want people with skills to come to Canada. So roughly 60% to 70% of our whole immigration intake since IRPA came in has been economic. And economics said you had to have skills, you had to have money. There was a financial component that said, if you want to immigrate to Canada, put in your application, tell us about your education, tell us about your language skills. And if you could get out on a point system, 67 out of 100, we would invite you. Okay. And you could come to Canada and bring your skills. And by the way, there was always a financial component that said you also had to have something called, you had to meet a low income cutoff. So you and your family could come to Canada with money. And it made sense at the time. And the people coming, we just said, look, we're giving you points for your age. And by the way, you got more points if you were under 50, okay? That was some recognition of the demographic problem. But you also got points for having a better education. You got points for having good work experience and language, okay? Initially, language wasn't thought to be so good. So 2002, there wasn't even a language test. But that came in about 2005. And now people had to have a good language to be able to fit in better, because having a good language meant you could get a better job when you came here.
Yep.
And this all seemed to be working until they realized that with the same time around 2000 is when the internet really expanded and smartphones started. Well, maybe smartphones are a little bit later. But I know I went through the time period where I started working before there were fax machines, okay? And I was in the corporate world, and we finally got the email in like 1993 or something or whatever.
And you had to get a 60-minute disc in the internet just to access it, right? You got a 60-minute free trial.
Remembers, and we all remember the dial-up. You dial up your modem and the sounds that made. But this became much different with the World Wide Web and the whole internet thing. Just after we brought in IRPA, so we put in this policy that said let's bring in skilled workers based on a point system of up to 100 points. And if you got 67 points or more, you were going to be processed. You just had to wait in line, because everybody's fair. It's first in, first out, wait in line. Well, by around 2004, 2005, the government realized that the widespread knowledge about Canada and the point system all of a sudden was creating a demand, because we couldn't handle all of the people coming in. We knew that we only have limited resources in terms of healthcare and all of this. You couldn't simply open the gates wide, and let 1 million people a year come in to a population of 20 million.
Yeah,
we couldn't adjust. So we started having, we had to have a system that worked on it. And we found out in about 2007 that the wait times were starting to move into the years, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years from somebody applying from outside Canada. And people started asking questions, well, how do we know that the skills they're bringing in then are what we want today?
So that was purely just a volume thing?
That was just a volume thing generated by massive understanding of the system. Something also happened where in 2006, immigration consultants became legal. And they turned out to be a remarkably powerful marketing agent for immigrants to come to Canada. You made your living as an immigration consultant in those years. You might have had you traveled overseas to provide seminars and to explain to people what coming to Canada meant, and then you could help them with their immigration paperwork, which is part of the legal process. And so that's how you made a living for many of them. You brought in people from overseas. Now, as communications and smartphones became more apparent, and we started to get tools like video conferencing and then Zoom or Skype in the early days, you didn't have to travel so much, but the market was still overseas. Well, by 2008, the government realized we have too many people. We have too many people in the queue. They're going to be waiting forever. And they then started saying, wait a minute, we're only going to accept 40 different occupational groups, but they didn't say how many. So as an example, we needed community college teachers for our expanding community college system. And we probably had a shortage of 200. And when they put them in as a category, enterprising agents went out there and recruited 20,000. Well, they all went into the queue. Okay.
Oh my goodness.
The next year, the government decided, oh, wait a minute, we better put a limit on the number of people we're inviting. But they didn't know how to manage the system, and it got worse. So we ended up with a backlog of hundreds of thousands of people in the queue for skilled workers. We're still bringing in family class, and we're accepting refugees. But
just in terms of skilled workers.
Yeah, we're not talking economic class. These are the people we want. Well, the problem really then started where they said, we can't afford to have people waiting queue 8 or 9 years to come into Canada. And people would wait. They sent out a survey to all of the people in the queue saying, hey, we'll give you back your money, okay, if you want to withdraw your file. Well, 98% of them didn't withdraw their file, even if they've been waiting. They made a plan, as people do, right? And these people, by the way, they were a good deal. These are people who we didn't have to pay the cost of their birth. We didn't have to pay the cost of maintaining them as children, of educating them, of gaining their work experience. We didn't have to pay any of those costs. Their home countries did. We just took them, ready-made, ready to contribute to the Canadian economy.
That's an interesting way of looking at it. It's almost like an assembly line. They did all the assembly, and now we have the tool.
Yeah, we had the finished product without having to pay any of the costs of the assembly line and the parts development and all that stuff. People forget about that when they talk about immigrants coming to Canada and can they work right away. All right. Well, they come as they're bringing they used to bring their physical assets to come and till the fields, and the farmers in Saskatchewan and the prairies, and 100 years ago, they brought their physical skills. Now they're bringing their intellectual skills from they've learned in schools and work experience to Canada to help enrich our country. Well, the government then did something which to me I think was completely un-Canadian. In 2010, they announced that they were going to cancel 150,000 files in the queue because they couldn't handle them. So this is like saying, the hockey score, you're winning 6-0 in the third period with a minute to go, and the referee says, okay, low score wins. All right. To me, this was entirely un-Canadian, but they did it. Okay. Yeah. Immigration Department has a lot of power. They then came along with a system in 2014, which they borrowed from Australia and New Zealand, called the Express Entry System, because they couldn't control the intake. So they instead went to a system that said, okay, tell us all about yourself. Send us a profile. It's free. We want to know about your education, your language, your work experience, all those factors. All you have to do is prove your education experience by getting an independent assessment of your education, with no more worrying about, was this a valid degree from India or from, Germany or wherever. And the other thing you have to do is prove your language skills. Do a language test. All right. And tell us what your French and English language abilities are. And with that, we would then assess you points. Okay. But this is not an application. It's free. You're just going into a pool. We now, the Immigration Department, we can manage the target of immigration better by selecting only the numbers we want to select. So they would say,
this is the lottery system that you're talking about.
It's a lottery system, except it's a lottery system based not on the cost of the lottery, but on your points. They're called CRS points. And you got points again for same as the 67 points out of 100. They kept that for one category, but they also said, if you come to Canada as a student or as a worker and you work in Canada for a year, you could also now go into the pool. Okay, you didn't have to have 67 points. You just went into the pool because you had 1 year valid Canadian work experience. It's called Canada Experience Class. They started that around 2005 to keep students in the country, who were graduating and then had to leave before they could apply. We said, well, why waste all their time in Canada? So they brought in the Canada Experience Class. They brought in, and they also had the Federal Skilled Worker class, which was the 67 points, and Federal Skilled Trades people who had a trade certification could come in under those three streams. And as of 2014, but the way they set their points, okay, this way they could control intake. We all were skeptical, but they said if you put in your profile and if we select you, we will process you in 6 months. So that meant you didn't have to wait around for years and years and years, and they didn't have this massive queue. Yeah. And guess what? It worked. They were able to process that number of files every 6 months, for people coming in. But the way they chose the points led to where we are now. This is sort of like
seems like quite the transition, though, going from the queue to a lottery. And in your opinion, you're saying that actually worked. It was good. It
did work because now they could control the intake. Okay. So you could set up your production facility. And immigration is a production. It's a facility that produces 8 million widgets a year. Widgets meaning an immigration benefit. Yeah. And it handles 8 million or more applications a year. So you got to have a factory. All right. And so the system now is able to say, we know what our demand will be. The demand for spousals was about the same every year. The demand for refugees was up and down, but overall about the same. But now the skilled workers, which are 65% of our whole intake, we could actually control that demand. But, it came by saying, what are the rules? People need to know the rules before you come. So how do you get points? Well, the immigration department is made up of young, the processing and most of the department is made up of young, university educated, bilingual individuals. So the express entry profile that you had to meet was really close to that. So they gave a lot of points if you were under 30. By the way, if you were over 30 and closer to 40 or 45, forget about it. You weren't coming. You couldn't get enough points. Okay. They also said if you're bilingual, even more than having a job in Canada, the language benefit seemed to be more important. We always disagreed with that, and we've been proven right over the years. So when they set up express entry, you started bringing in young people who were university educated. You got more points if you were educated in Canada, more points if you worked in Canada, and more points if you were under 30. Okay, so from 2014 on, those are the kind of people that we were bringing in to Canada, along with everyone else. But it took, you put in your profile, it took a few months before you got accepted. Then if you were selected, then it took 2 or 3 months to apply and then 6 months to process.
So in the shoes of the person that's immigrating, is that a better process from their end too? Like, I know it worked better for us as Canadians and from the government and immigration as a whole, but from their perspective, was that easier to get into the country? I don't know if easier is the best word, but we'll use easy just because
in order to get the points, because as soon as they started selecting people, and the score was out of 1,000, but there are some ways to get extra points. If you had a job in Canada at the time, you got 600 points. The pass mark, the selection levels were like 440 points.
Okay.
So you knew if you actually had a valid job in Canada and you met the language standard, you met the education standard, you had to have at least high school, and you met the education standard, and you could prove all of that, and you had 1 year work experience. If you got over 450 points, you were in. Well, if somebody in Canada offered you a job and is a valid job offer in a skilled trade, not a low skill, you got 600 points. Well, a cook, anybody getting a job in Canada was on the fast track to permanent residency. And why not? They're working, they're paying taxes. Okay.
Yeah, that's what you want.
This was going fine, and the pass mark was staying relatively stable until COVID. COVID really kicked the crap out of the system, and understanding the problems in the system. You've got a government department that is not state of the art by any means, by the way. Their IT systems were not state of the art. They proved it with the Phoenix pay system. Most government departments, you don't look to the government for leadership in technology. Their processing systems were average at best. And when COVID came, unlike any other country in the world, Canada shut down its immigration system on March 20th of 2020. And then when they shut it down, they had 65 visa posts doing immigration. They had 110 visa application centers, which were private businesses helping many countries do the intake, including Canada, US, UK. These application centers would take your application and make sure it was mailed to the right place and it was complete. They didn't do any decision making, but mostly for visitors and these millions and millions and millions of travelers all over the world. It was helping them with all of that. And they had about 4 major processing centers in Canada, including Edmonton, Ottawa, Sydney, Nova Scotia. All of those centers were processing all of these applications while they sent everybody home. In Canada, they went home, literally out of their offices. Ottawa was a ghost town. In all the visa posts, they brought every Canadian home, and they sent all of the locally engaged staff home, and all of the visa application centers shut down. So there was nothing, absolutely nothing happening for 2020. Finally, they started to open some processes for people who had, when vaccines finally came in 2021, we all remember. Yeah. I don't know if you had a vaccine. I know I had a vaccine, and they asked me if I had any side effects, and I said, well, yeah, it's a side effect that most people have, but nobody talks about. They said, what's that? I said, I was smiling. I couldn't stop smiling because now I knew I was going to live. I'm an older guy and I have my own health issues. I knew I could have my first vaccine. I started smiling a lot more, and so did everybody.
It gave you that peace of mind, right?
Yeah. But then with immigration, they started to allow people in who had been vaccinated, or who could prove, we had to go through tests to prove you wore a mask all the time and you proved you had no health problems. You started letting some people in. So the system really could handle all the, even though the system was broken, it could handle the minimum demand. Yeah. But then in in September of 2021, they just opened the doors and they said, okay, vaccines are widely available. If you've been vaccinated, you can come. Well, the numbers of applications they got just blew everybody away. The economy, as you know, recovered much faster than we all expected. Yeah. And along came the whole process of people or the pent-up demand of people wanting to visit family, the demands for people, for workers to handle in the tourism industry, all of those people, they couldn't handle the intake now. Companies could hire again all of a sudden because the economy was going gangbusters again. Well,
and I feel like, Phil, like everyone was moving at a speed of 200% than they normally would after we finally got these lockdowns lifted. Yep. So everything that would normally move at 100% is now moving at 200%.
The problem is the creaky old processing system and the number of people working from home who, when the immigration first shut down, they told their people, look, you can work from home. Well, that after 3 months, they realized, no, you can't, because none of your computers are rated for the Privacy Act, because there are privacy restrictions. So the government said, wait, we'll get you laptops to all of their visa officers working from home. Well, the procurement department didn't have anybody in it, and they couldn't supply laptops. So then they said to people, go out and buy your own laptops. And all of these employees, many of whom were victims of the Phoenix problem, where they couldn't even pay people, said, I'm not spending my own money hoping to get it back. So the system took a long time to adjust. Wow. All right. And people were all working from home and they couldn't even handle files. And yet this intake started coming in, and the first thing that happened, of course, was the backlogs just blossomed. They just exploded. So everybody in the department is thinking, oh my God, what do we do? How do we do this? And I took part in several discussions about how they could simplify certain processes to get the processing times down to make it easier. Like, why worry about certain things when there was never a problem, and so the floodgates in effect opened. They made it easier for people to get into Canada. They brought in a new program for students that said, look, we kept showing us proof of how much money you had. Forget all that. Just deposit $20,000 or $50,000 into an account in Canada and have the bank pay your student every month so they don't spend it all on wine, women, and song the first day. Okay. Students will do and run out of food, but so make sure you've got that, and we'll approve
back it. They're taking loans on property and businesses and things like that just to be able to dump that money into those accounts. I had heard you speak about that previously on a other episode. Yeah.
Yeah. And then to make matters even worse, the express entry system, which was the pass mark was around 460, 450 at the time. Well, nobody was coming, right? And in 2020, we didn't hit our targets. We missed most of the targets because nobody could physically get here. So in 2021, when everything opened up again, and in early 2022, they realized we're not going to make our targets. Well, what they did was they had a whole lot of people in the pool. Well, they dropped the pass mark down from 460 down to 70.
No, they didn't.
And they took everybody in there. They were all people who were qualified. They were all people ready to come, but they took them down to 70, and even that didn't do it. So they came in with a special program called the Temporary to Permanent Resident Pathway, which said if you've graduated from a Canadian university and you now are working anywhere, even at McDonald's, you can qualify. File your application over the next 3 months. Well, boy, did they get applications.
I was just going to say, they probably got more applications than they've ever seen before.
Right. And the other side of it was they also knew that we just didn't have enough temporary people working in Canada to meet the demand of the agricultural industry, of the restaurant industry. So they started saying, in the past, if you were a high skilled person, or if you were a student, you couldn't bring your wife to Canada and your kids. That wasn't allowed. And if you got a work permit, you could only work 40 hours a week maximum. Mm. Well, they said for all students, you can now work. I mean, you can only work 20 hours a week. I'm sorry. Well, they said to all the students, you can now work as many hours a week as you want. Okay.
Oh, there's not even a cap at 40. It's overtime, whatever you can.
Yeah. And take a full-time job and attend school while you can. Then they said, oh, and by the way, bring your wife and kids, and they can all get work permits. And, so 2021 and 2022, that all happened. 2022, what happened in February when Russia attacked Ukraine. Yeah. We then facilitated 300,000 Ukrainians coming to Canada, giving them work permits. Instead of waiting for them to claim refugee status in a camp overseas, let them come to Canada. As long as they can work, let them work. Okay.
Yep.
So now all of those people are coming in temporarily with work permits, and agents around the world took a look at Canada and said, oh my goodness, by the way, if you come to Canada on a work permit, or if you come to Canada to study, get your 1-year degree, you get a 1-year work permit, you're going to be a permanent resident, because look at the points you get for that, because that's what the system was giving them. All right.
Which is going to be much higher than the 70.
Well, yeah. And the 70 now, sure. And then it went to 420, and then it went to 450. But then in 2023, it went to 480 and to 500, because so many people here. But we were bringing in, instead of 60,000 students a year, we were bringing in 300,000 students a year. Yes. We were bringing in lots of temporary foreign workers, because with open work permits, never mind the LMIA process, which has always been a small part of the program. And agents around the world were going out to farmers in India saying, hey, send your kids to Canada. All they have to do is go to school for 8 months. They can work full-time while they're in school. Then they get a work permit. They're making $40,000 a year, and they'll be a permanent resident. And, you're going to live like a Raja in India, a Maharaja, in India, instead of on your 6 acres of farmland. And the program was sold like crazy, because there's a huge marketing arm who said, this is okay. This is the way things work. And that's created the biggest problem we now have, which is too many temporary residents in Canada.
Correct me if I'm wrong.
Rental costs.
And I'll let you get back to talking about the rental costs, because that's actually going to lead me into a couple of the questions I have for you with some of the new changes. But that seems like a lot of mismanagement. Not so much that it's a problem or that somebody did something directly wrong. It seems like just mismanagement. Like the back's against the wall. We got to make a solution. Let's just do whatever works for the time being, and then we'll change it down the road.
Yeah, you're exactly right. It was mismanagement, but it wasn't by mismanagement by the politicians.
I get it, yeah.
Because the politicians don't understand immigration anyway. They don't know enough. They get many politicians in their MPs in their offices get nothing but immigration clients coming in, but it's always about little problems with the system, and people don't understand the system. Most of them, a few of them, if any, even the ones who are lawyers, don't understand how the immigration system worked.
Immigration is a talking point for politicians, and it begins and ends there, in my opinion.
Yeah. So, unfortunately, what was happening was the bureaucrats in charge of the department, and you have to understand that the people in charge of the immigration department value independence and independent decision-making above all else. They don't like it when a minister comes along and tells them what to do. They would rather, just like all of us, we'd rather manage our own careers and our own business, right? And they believe they are qualified to manage their business because they understand they're actually senior executives in a massive corporation, if you will. And they don't want someone being elected who doesn't know anything coming in telling them what to do. So what happens? They really like the fact that immigration ministers change every year. It's a junior ministry. It's a ministry where politicians and the minister themselves cannot affect individual cases. In the 2000s, people forget, we had 2 immigration ministers who had to resign because they interceded. They tried to intercede for their clients, to get them visas or something, or their staff did. And that was it. They were out. Okay. Yeah. So there's only been one minister of immigration who lasted more than a few years, who actually was starting to make decisions. That was Jason Kenney. Okay. He could actually form opinions, understand the system, and tell them what to do. Since then, no minister has been able to do that. Some of them are good at making decisions. Mark Miller could make all the decisions, but the department tells them what the decisions are. The department, the politicians bring them problems. The department tells them how the system is going to answer their problems. Well, in those 2021, 2022, 2023, the people in charge, the people at the top, they knew how many students were coming in every day. They knew how many temporary foreign workers were coming in every day. And they just lost sight of the bigger picture. They were tied up in problems of the processing system being broken down, and none of the people being in their offices to work. And, you can make excuses for them, but ultimately they're the ones responsible. And it didn't matter which party was in power, the same thing would have happened. And those same people are never held accountable, because as soon as someone might want to, the ministers change. We've had 7 immigration ministers, I think, since 2020, including one who was here for a month. I mean, now we have an immigration minister, and there's enough to be said about her. But those people were never held accountable, and now we're dealing with that as a massive problem. First, we had, they've done a good job. They've actually done all the things necessary to reduce the number of temporary residents, and in fact, they're going to go too far, and they have gone too far. And so we've got certain areas of the immigration system now that are suffering badly. Entrepreneurs. If you can imagine, people come to Canada, they come with money, they start a business, they invest in that business, they hire Canadians, small entrepreneurs, which are the heart and soul of our employment structure.
Yep.
Many of them for the last 2 years have had no path to permanent residence at all. And entrepreneurs who come to Canada, set up a business, are in Canada, have hired people, 5, 10, 20 people. There is no path to permanent residence for them.
That seems backwards, because what you just said was that they're coming into the country, creating business, helping the economy. That's what builds an economy is creating business. How many jobs have you created?
Who runs the department? Senior civil servants.
Yeah.
Who are not entrepreneurs. Who in fact may well be populated, and whatever your politics, it's quite understandable that their particular politics do not lend themselves towards entrepreneurial endeavors. They're looking for system fixes, not entrepreneurs. Plus, you have a problem where an inefficient system is subject to fraud, and there is fraud in the entrepreneurial system, just like there's fraud in false marriages and other parts in the refugee system.
But the students, we learned about that recently. Allegedly, there's stuff going on with some of the students and fraud and some of the
for sure. There's always
in.
fraud in any program, but the business immigration program, typically the senior management of the department does not like entrepreneurs. They just don't like them. We had a federal investor program that was canceled in 2014, and 20,000 files were canceled. We've had entrepreneur programs. We just had the worst program in the world, the startup visa program. If you can imagine, this program started to give the minister talking points on business immigration, because he was in California and he saw all these signs about entrepreneurs, and Steve Jobs was the hero of the day. And what they did was they set up a program called the Startup Visa Program to bring in innovators. Okay, they wanted the next Steve Jobs to create the next Apple. Of course, if Steve Jobs would have applied to Canada in those days, he wouldn't have been admitted because he had a criminal record and he was a druggie. Okay. But they set up this program, and they set it up as a pilot program. And after 5 years, we were bringing in self-employed, not a good program at all, an investor program where you just gave money. Yeah, they weren't perfect programs, but we're bringing in somewhere between 10 and 20,000 entrepreneurs a year. They set up this pilot program, and after 5 years, they had issued 75 permanent resident cards. Okay, 75. I was at a session where we had, under the Conference Board of Canada, and we hosted a session, and the lady was saying, after 5 years, the pilot program, is over. And I said, so you're canceling it, right? Because it hasn't worked. She says, oh no, we're making it a permanent program. And we thought, what? And what they did was they relaxed the intake rules. So with the points going up in the express entry system, where people, if they're over 40, can't get in, because this is what was happening. Now they said, hey, if you can start a business, if you have an innovative idea, come to Canada. We know that you'll fail, but even if you fail, you'll still be a permanent resident. And by the way, if you have that idea and apply, you don't even have to come to Canada before you're a permanent resident. You can start this. Well, guess what happened with the marketing arm of the immigration profession? They just took that program. I can only imagine. and started to run with it. And to the point where this past January, there were, well, when they cut down on the immigration levels at the end of 2024, okay, and then again at 2025, that program had a waiting list of 40,000 people. Now that's, husbands, wives, and children, right? 40,000 people. You know what the quota was set for them for this year?
What's that?
500. So if you're waiting and you filed your permanent resident application and you're 40,000, we're taking 500, that means you have an 80-year wait. Now, to make it even worse, they said some of the people in that 40,000 we're going to give preference to because they've got higher funding from a venture capital firm or an angel investor. There's money invested in them. We're going to give them priority, and we're going to move them all to the front of the line. There's still like 10,000 of them, okay? And they're at the front of the line of a target of 500. Oh, and the 500 also includes athletes, entertainers, and other self-employed artists. That's all in line, okay? So guess what? That program, they stopped all the intake this year, and we have people stranded here, entrepreneurs running businesses, because some of them succeeded. They're running businesses. I mean, the program highlights a couple of major benefits. I think Skip the Dishes is one program that was started by entrepreneurs. Apply Board, who help people find study permits all over the world. They were one of the beneficiaries, but there are very few innovative programs because 90% fail anyway. That's just fact of life. Anyway, so now we're in the situation where we have all of these problems, and the situation, the government has already reacted to most of them, but people have been hurt. And the tide is starting to turn, I believe. Okay. And we have some symptoms of that, but this is sort of like a really compendium of the way the system has gotten into the trouble that it's in.
Well, it paints the perfect picture as to what's actually going on now and what changes are being implemented and why. And that's some of the questions that I will ask you. And I love the fact that you not only just schooled me on how the system got this way, but you also said something very predominant here, my friend. And maybe it's just predominant in my own frontal lobe, but it literally is, we don't understand. Most Canadians don't understand how the system got this way. And they're easy to throw stones at things that those aren't your targets. Your targets seem to be, it's a lot of mismanagement.
Well, just so people don't think that I'm just somebody who's spouting off a theory, I should give you some credentials. I spent 30 years in the corporate world, including working in a major international corporation in sales and marketing, strategic planning, and troubleshooting. At one point, I was assigned by my company to go in different countries in the world who were not performing and to help them redo themselves, if you will. That's just part of the skill set that I have. And now I've got into immigration. It's now 27 years that I've been doing this, but I wasn't just practicing immigration. I also volunteered and got into the Consultants Association. I was president of that group during some very tumultuous times, and I had to work with the government, and I met with government people many times. And then as we had a fight over better regulation, we set up a brand new we had a revolt, and I was the first CEO of the regulatory body. And I worked with government people and many hardworking, conscientious people. And having to practice and work that closely with the government, you do get to understand something. And being what I like to think of myself as a strategic thinker. Okay, and I subscribe to some other strategic thinkers like Peter Zeihan, if you know him, and others. You fall into that path. It's not a special skill. It's not to put myself above anything. But when you're used to thinking about these issues, you start looking at all of the problems like from a big picture standpoint. And you gain some experience that way. And God knows, prediction is never, you can't predict. That's the bottom line. But you can certainly look back and say, okay, these are the major factors that contributed. So that's where the things I'm telling you, that's where that comes from. Just so to give you a bit of credibility, which if you want to include in this video or cut it, you can do that. You don't need to.
No, this is staying in for sure. For any audience that hasn't seen a previous episode yet, they now got their reschooling on who Phil is and why he's so educated in this field. But Phil, so you're saying you can't predict the future, right? So we're not gonna lay out a track, and I'm not gonna ask questions that lead to, okay, what's gonna happen here? But what I can ask you, and maybe you can at least give me an idea of a path that's being laid out, whether it's gonna follow through or not. There's new changes coming, right? There's been some new, it seems like this year they've done a lot of work trying to fix some of the problems and make new avenues. Can you explain to our audience and myself exactly what is being changed here
Sure.
in terms of over the past couple of weeks and month?
Well, again, and to link it back to what we've been talking about, the express entry system, which is, they can change parts of the express entry system, award points for different features, whatever. So it's very flexible. But up until 2023, it was based on, we want young people, highly educated, bilingual, with work experience in Canada, educated in Canada. That's what the system was. Well, when they got the numbers in for 2023, out of the target for skilled workers, which is, like I said, 65% of of our immigration intake, 80% of them were 23 years of age. So now we're bringing in people who have gone to school, graduated, had a work experience, maybe at a McDonald's or somewhere. And those are the people that we're changing the makeup of Canada to match those people. And even people in the department could recognize that that's not it. The idea for immigration is Canada is a mosaic. We're not a melting pot. We love all our festivals from all the different countries. We want, as Irish Canadians, we like to call ourselves Irish Canadians, as whatever.
I still do.
Yeah, we like hyphenated Canadians. We like a mosaic, and most people in Canada like that because it links them to their past. And in a new country, which we call ourselves, is it's hard to do that culturally, so that it links you to your past and gives you a sense of place. So we're a mosaic. Well, what IRCC was doing was changing Canada to become a knowledge elite, from a mosaic. Well, mosaics are made up of all kinds of people. They're made up of the hardworking Italians who came in the 50s and the Portuguese and, opened the bakeries and opened the construction companies who are now, third, fourth generation Canadians doing extremely well. That's the hardworking people that come in, and we actually, you could see the effects of that form of immigration in the point where last year Canada had the highest percentage of university graduates of any country in the world. And
really, I didn't even know that fact.
Yes, and by a long shot. And in fact, that if you're a parent, you're so proud when your kids go to university and get a degree and all this stuff. But what it really says is we have too many of those people.
So I was just going to say, as a Canadian, I'm proud of Canadians being educated, but
but
you're right, there's another side of that coin.
It's a bit like if you ever read Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Everybody's in marketing, right? I don't know if anybody who's a fan of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy will know that story and what happened to those marketing people. I'm
limited at best with my science fiction.
Okay, well, they eventually had to decide on it. They all got banned to one planet, and they all had to get together and work out what currency to use, and most importantly, what color it was. And they chose leaves. So they used up all the leaves on the planet, which ruined the environment and destroyed the planet. Anyway, but that's the trouble is they were allowing in that picture, that type of a Canadian mosaic. They were hurting the mosaic, if you will. So they started to change the express entry system to the point where we all used to be in one pool, okay? And yes, you had a section for federal skilled workers and a section for skilled tradespeople. And when they would take the people from the top of the pool, which is what they do, every 2 weeks, they would take people from the top of the pool. You would get, the pass mark would be a little lower if you were a tradesperson because we needed more tradespeople by then. Well, they came in 2023 and they said, wait a minute, we're going to make different sections of the pool. Because, by the way, we need medical professionals. We don't need more people with a 1-year diploma in marketing with 1-year work experience. We have, the pass mark for those people is up to 540. And by the way, you didn't get 600 points for a job anymore. They took away the 600 points and gave you 50 points for a job. They gave you 200 points if you were an executive. But then a year and a half ago, that's what a lot of entrepreneurs would use to become a permanent resident. Well, a year and a half ago, they took away the 200 points because there was some fraud in the system somewhere, and they can't fine tune anything. The immigration department manages the immigration system the way somebody is playing a piano with mitts on. Okay.
Yeah.
You might recognize the tune, but it's not going to be very precise. Right.
And from, like I said, to put myself back in the shoes of somebody who's immigrating to Canada, this must be the most confusing process.
Yeah. I mean, understanding it is confusing, but then again, knowing the motivation. So there was a sea change that said, hey, A, we got too many people coming in temporarily, and B, they're not the right kind of people that we're admitting permanently. Okay. And some of it was happenstance, 300,000 Ukrainian refugees, 100,000 almost Iranians, who are allowed to stay in the country because of what's been going on in Iran. And, these sort of things, those are big numbers. All right. But in terms of the permanent resident side, what they've been doing now is they've really moved that category along to the point where the biggest province, Ontario, which has you have the federal government selecting under the express entry system, but almost half of the economic, 40% of the economic class is also allocated to each province. The theory being they can select people that they need specifically, and it works, and they're sort of linked, all right? And the provinces, some of them have been hit and miss with regards to who they've been selecting, and the federal government shut down several of the provincial nomination programs because of really weird practices, and so they've all had to adjust over the years, all right? When IRPA came in, there was no PNP programs, but they started coming in after that. But anyway, that's a learning curve that takes years to learn. But now they have what the changes that are now coming is, instead of this one big pool, you're now getting several small sections of the pool. That's over the last 2 years. And finally, they've come to the point where they said, okay, we now know, broadly speaking, who we need in Canada. If you want to get in the pool, you have to be one of those people in those sections. You just can't even get in the pool if you're not. All right.
Okay.
Now, there's two levels of change. The Ontario government, which has got the biggest allocation of the provinces, and some other of the provinces are now changing their process to favor certain categories of employment. So medical people, okay? There was at time transport, but then we got too many truck drivers, so they canceled that one. There's a category for, sorry, my age things get a little fuzzy, but they got 4 or 5 main categories that if you're in those categories, you get the extra points. That means you're going to get selected first. So now the system is really fine tuning it itself, and they can change it from 1 year to the next. Okay, like I said, when they originally started doing these categories, truck drivers and transport workers were one of them because we had a shortage. After 2 years of that, they said, no, we got enough now. So they no longer get preferential treatment. They've closed that silo, if you will. And the medical one will go on for the next couple of years. Oh, teachers. Now we have a shortage of teachers again. Executives. There's one for executives in corporations, because you could be the president of Exxon in Canada, who's been transferred here for 10 years. You couldn't become a permanent resident because you were definitely not in your 30s. Okay, and you got no age points because you were over 40.
That makes sense.
Well, now there's a separate category for senior managers, and you can go into the express entry information. It's all available on the website, and you can do that. Ontario has now changed its entire program. They used to give categories like if you got a master's degree, you were in. If you got a PhD, you were in. We were in a meeting with the officials from the Ontario government last fall, and they were complaining. They said, look, we're bringing in master's people and PhDs who have no hope of getting a job. I mean, what good is a master's in Egyptian hieroglyphics? You might need one, and we're letting in everybody that has one. Okay.
Yeah. Well, it looks like they're even, and maybe I'm wrong here, but the research that I've done, they're offering 15 points to candidates making $40 or an hour.
Well, that's the second thing they were doing. Okay. They used to say that, by the way, every job in Canada, do you know what an NOC is?
No, explain to me.
Okay.
I might,
So
but
every single job in Canada is categorized under the National Occupation Code.
okay, yes.
It's a code, and it tells you what the average rate of pay is across the country, what the highest, what the range of pay is. It tells you what the main job duties are, specific job duties. It lists all the titles of jobs. If you want to go in, look up NOC, and you can look up your own job title and see what anybody else in Canada is making and earning. And they track all of this in the labor force statistics. We have good statistics in there. So what they're now saying is, they used to say that in order to get a work permit in Canada, you had to get, and you had to be paid the median wage. In other words, not the lowest or the highest. You had to be paid the median wage. So everybody out there who's been saying, that the temporary foreign worker program depresses wages, just doesn't understand. When you're working in a restaurant or a factory and you have to be paid the average wage, you're making more than half the people in the store or in the factory. How does that, and what employer would pay you more than they would pay a Canadian when they don't have to pay anything to recruit you? To recruit a Canadian. When you're recruiting internationally, there are all kinds of costs, fees, advertising, government fees, recruiters' fees. It opens itself up to international recruiters who get paid by the employee to go to Dubai and to go to Saudi Arabia,
I'm a simpleton and I caught on to that as well. I've never understood that argument. I don't know why people think that that's a thing. It doesn't even seem logical.
Well, it also goes along with, there is a bias amongst employers. Once they hire temporary foreign workers whose life depends on going to work and keeping their job, so they show up for work, compared to a 17-year-old who decides to call in and say, I got a football game tonight, I'm not coming to work.
Yeah, some Canadian Nepo baby or something, right?
Well, and we know that kids are like that, but so are some other people like that. So employers like temporary foreign workers, but you still have to prove that you tried to hire the Canadians first. Anyway, so you now what they're saying, and what they were saying is, if you had to have one of those jobs, but now what they're saying is, we actually don't care what you were making in your previous employment, and we don't care what your employer pays you in Canada now. If the NOC average wage is above the Canadian median wage, you're going to get extra points. So let's say the average Canadian median wage is $50,000 a year. Yeah. If you're paid under that, you're going to lose some points in your selection. Not if you're paid that. If your job says you should be paid that, according to the national statistics, all right, then, if, there's a big difference. If you're a kosher butcher in Toronto, the average median wage is $35 an hour. If you're a kosher butcher in Halifax, it's $24 an hour. Don't ask me why. It's just, that's what the statistics show. So if you're a kosher butcher and you want to apply for permanent residence, you have the same skills, same person, same age, same everything, you get fewer points than the guy in Ontario. Now you'll get the same points because the median wage you're above the median wage. Okay.
Well, anyway, they're also probably going to get the same points because there's a penalty on Toronto now, apparently, as well.
Yeah, there is for a lot of these kinds of options. So if you take a look at the occupation itself is going to give you extra points. They've now said, I don't care if you got your degree from Canada or from Uzbekistan or from Denmark. Everybody with an equivalent degree gets the same points. You get no points for Canadian education, all right? You get limited points for Canadian work experience. The work experience has to be at the higher wage, okay, and it has to be more than 1 year. That's where you get the points. Now, Ontario has added some additional changes. By the way, the Federal Express Entry Program, they've already announced changes that will be happening. They just haven't taken effect yet. That's much bigger than just the Ontario one. But Ontario themselves have also said that every person coming and expecting to be nominated as a skilled worker in Ontario must have a job offer from an approved employer. So the first step in getting permanent residence through Ontario is you have to have a job offer from an Ontario employer who has registered with the province, has gone through the hoops and shown they're eligible. The only one exception to that is if you're a physician, a doctor. You don't need a job offer. Well, and now, that's sense. Because we have such a shortage of doctors. Okay.
If you're a doctor and you scream on the side of the street, I need work, you'll be hired by the time or even done the
and
sentence.
to be honest with you, just as a little aside, this is a benefit of the immigration system that says these people can come to Canada to work, that flies in the face of 60 years, of the doctors protecting their own. Okay, because the doctors, since Medicare came in Saskatchewan in 1961, doctors associations across the country have tried to protect their own by making the standards to become a doctor much higher. In effect, non-trade barriers or whatever, non-immigration barriers, just to protect themselves. And they because the Saskatchewan government at the time broke the monopoly of the doctors by bringing in foreign doctors, mostly from England, South Africa, other Commonwealth countries that spoke English. They brought them in and they broke the doctors' strike. Okay, I know, because as a young person, my mother dragged me downtown Saskatoon with a sign to protest against the doctors. Okay, tells you where my politics were, but I was in Saskatchewan. All right.
Hey, it sounds like you've been on the ground floor for a lot of this, my friend, and it's probably why you have such a good experience and a hell of a vast amount of knowledge on this. And it's funny because my last question was actually about the physician exception, and you just answered it. You're beating me to all my questions here.
Oh, well,
I only got to ask one.
You must have read my mind, and that's scary.
Well, Phil, I'm actually a fan. Like I said, I love the previous episodes that you've done with the guys. I feel like the knowledge that I have about immigration, this comes from you and Nir Rosenberg. You guys have done a great job not only teaching me, but I think anybody who's watched this gets a little bit more clarification out of these conversations, right?
Yeah.
It's easy, like I said, to throw stones at things that you don't understand.
Well, the part that maybe we could close on is what's going to happen next. Okay.
Please do.
So fundamentally, I believe the tide is turning. We now know that, yes, too many temporary residents cause rents to increase for students and everybody else. We've seen the outcome of having fewer students and fewer temporary foreign workers, where rents are now, the landlords are just suffering. The impact of immigration on housing was a myth. Look at what's happened. We've got fewer immigrants, but the housing market in Toronto and Vancouver are just in the absolutely down. Mortgage rates are far more important than immigration. Government policies or lending practices are far more important than immigration. So those myths are gone. We're starting to see shortages of workers in certain areas of the country where we have them for sure because of demographics. Something like 50,000 more people leave the workforce every year because they're getting old, like me. They're baby boomers. The last of the baby boomers will be retiring, or will hit 65 in 2030. All right. Yeah. And that's the biggest generation. There are twice as many baby boomers as there are new generation. What is it? Gen Y, not the late 0 to 20 right now. There's twice as many baby boomers as there were then. So who's going to take their jobs?
We're so far past all of these different names for these new generations. I think I've actually reached that point where I'm like, nah, I don't care. That's the youth. Yeah.
So we're going to see,
just call them the youth.
I believe we'll see a turning point about immigration. The only wild card is there's all the crazies out there that hate immigrants and are racist and bigots. They've had enough fuel. That's part one.
So Phil, for years, I used to tell everybody up until about 10 years ago, I said, I've grown up in Canada my whole life. I don't think I've ever actually seen real racism. I can't say that anymore. Yeah. I've seen it over the past 10 years. It's slowly developed. I felt like it was just insensitive things 10 years ago. And now it's just,
welcome to the world of social media. It gave people a bit, but so that's one thing that's happening. We're also going to see the economy as it continues to grow. A lot of the numbers will come in. Per capita GDP has now gone up a lot because we have fewer people and the economy is still growing. Okay, so that one statistic that was being used to beat everybody over the head with. So we're going to see immigration, as long as we can recover from the bigotry and the hatred that's out there, we're going to see immigration become more positive. But there are a couple of major things to worry about. What's happened in the U.S. in the last month, I believe, has the potential to cause a massive influx of refugees into Canada. Not from Americans who want to leave. We get more of those now than ever, but it's still small numbers. But the U.S. had a system called temporary protected status. It's the same as what we've done for the Ukrainians coming to Canada. They're not refugees. They're not permanent residents. If they find a Canadian to marry and it's a good genuine marriage, they can become a permanent resident. If they qualify through the express entry system, they can use an oral. But most of them, they're here so that when the war ends, they can go back to Ukraine.
It's a safe haven for you.
It's a safe haven.
As long as you like, we're here to help. And when you can go back home, we'll do everything we can to get you back there safely.
Well, the U.S. has 1 million people like that under something called temporary protected status. And it's from several different countries. They've done it for countries that had earthquakes. They've done it for, the standard countries we all expect. Trump has ended temporary protected status for most of them. And the case went to the Supreme Court in June, and the Supreme Court agreed with Trump. And the work permits of all of those people were on work permits. And you heard the stories maybe from Springfield, Ohio, where the city was, it's a Rust Belt city. It's grown by 20% in the last 10 years, mostly because of Haitian workers working in the garment, in the industries, in the lower skilled areas in Cleveland, in Springfield. And that's across the U.S. There are 300,000 Haitians in the U.S. right now. Their work permits expired last Friday, and today the law comes into effect that they can be deported.
Oh my goodness.
These are French-speaking Haitians who've been working and living in the United States. Guess where a whole lot of their cousins are? In Quebec.
Canada. Yeah.
And Canada has something called the Safe Third Country Agreement, which only applies to the U.S. It says if you didn't claim asylum in the U.S., which is refugee status, then you can't come to Canada and claim it. We just turn you right around at the border, okay? Unless you have a family member in Canada or you're under 18, okay? We'll take those people. You can claim at the port of entry, all right? Well, Trump has also shut down the asylum system in the U.S. The only people now who they will process asylum claims from are white South Africans of all the world. That's
really
the only people they will process asylum claims. So what you've got is a range of legal issues trying to fight the decisions of Trump's executive orders, including people from countries like Sudan, et cetera, from Hong Kong, other places. And they're wending their way through the courts, but there's no guarantee the Supreme Court won't simply say no to them. All right. And there's challenges that said that they didn't really have the authority to do this, that Kirsty Noem, the Department of Homeland Security, she didn't have the authority to cancel these. Well, the Supreme Court's already said they do, but as of this week, it's illegal to employ any of those people in the United States. And without the ability, now, the new head of Mark, whatever his name is, head of the Homeland Security, said that, well, these people could have claimed any other way. They could have become naturalized Americans just like all other people do. Well, the answer is no, they can't. Even if they marry an American, which is one way to become a U.S. citizen. We've all seen the green card movies, which are light on fact. But you can marry an American citizen, even if you were illegal in the U.S. As long as you didn't enter illegally, you could have stayed there 10 years, marrying an American citizen. Same thing in Canada. Now they just changed the rules last spring to say, if you marry an American and you want to file for a green card, you must file in your home country, and you must leave and go to an interview in your home country. Well, you tell me which Sudanese is going to go to his home country, or which Iranian, or which Haitian, or which Hong Kongese, if they're going to go home. And most of these
some
people
of these
are,
ladies and gentlemen are here because they fear going back home.
They are. And where are they going to go? All right. And if you read some recent article in Globe and Mail, well, a lot of them are thinking about Canada. Now, the question Canada has to decide, and it's up to the immigration department to say, if they come to the border and say, I'm afraid the U.S. is going to deport me either to my home country or to a third country, which Canada would never accept. They'll deport me to El Salvador or somewhere like that. They'll deport me. I want to claim refugee status. Is Canada going to say to them, and I can't claim asylum? Okay. Is Canada going to say, you're not subject to the Third Country Act, we will accept you, or not? If they say yes, then the numbers are just going to go through the roof. If they say no, you can bet there'll be busloads of lawyers at every port of entry willing to file class action suits on behalf of all these people. So this is something which, over the next year to 2 years, I believe is going to inform Canadian opinion on immigration. because it's going to give ammunition to those we don't want to have ammunition. It could cause some sort of crisis between Quebec and Canada, because if the majority go to Quebec, the last time this happened, that's what happened as well. You know, we had all these people coming across the border in Quebec, and the Quebec government having to pay the bills. Well, the federal government stepped up. They're going to have to step up again. But anyway, that's my big fear about what's going to happen next. You know, they're getting the temporary resident stuff under control. It's under control. They're getting bringing the right people to support Canadian economy under control. You know,
I was actually, the more that you're talking about this, the more I see, you know, for last year, I was always saying to people when they started talking about the Americans, and I said, I think they're just trying to figure themselves out. I always try to give them the benefit of the doubt, right? Even though some of the stuff is just horrendous. And now where we are in July, the end of July, 2026, I just see nothing but a disaster down there. And unfortunately, Canada is paying the price for a lot of it.
Yes, you're right. And, you know, unfortunately, we can't tariff all these people that Trump's thrown out of the U.S. We can't put a tariff on them to not, you know, to limit their spread. You know, we're in a tough spot with the U.S. and all those things, but that's a whole other area. You know, in this case, I think we have to keep our mind about us, and, you know, knowing that we have an immigration system that is creaking along on technology that is, we want them to bring their IT systems up to the 20th century. You know, they're getting there, but nobody has any faith that, you know, we deal with these. By the way, the simple process of filing an application, we now do that through electronic online portals for all different categories. There isn't a day goes by that I'm on discussion groups that these portals don't crash. And sometimes
I've been saying it to our team, just even with uploading and things that we do with the TPL local tours and stuff. I like the more weeks go by, the more I realize Canada's internet is going to implode on itself.
Well, and all of this, you know, if you have a deadline, because lots of immigration programs have deadlines, you must file before, would you believe it's midnight Greenwich time? Okay, just to be confusing, if you file in Ontario, if you file after 5 p.m., you're out of status. But you're trying to get the paperwork together, and maybe you're trying to file 3 days in advance, and the portal goes down. You know, we live with these things every single day. And anyway, those are some of the things that you're hearing about. We have other issues, but they're technical issues which only immigration providers would understand. That happen within the system with AI and false decisions and all that. But anyway, we have a lot of trouble. Hopefully, you know, it'll still carry on. We have a great country here, and those of us in the profession believe we're blessed because we can help, you know, Canada grow properly and bring in the right people to make sure the country stays where it is. It's a gift. It's, you know, we're all very heavily regulated, and I think that's part of the benefit why many of us keep going. Okay, people need help with the systems, and you know, the government, it prides itself on saying you can use our systems. You don't need anybody's help. You don't need a lawyer or a consultant. You can do all this yourself. Well, we get a whole lot of business from people who do that and fail.
Yeah. And just like everything, I think people thought they'd become their own real estate agent there for a while too, right? And some of them convinced themselves, and maybe they got through one of those deals, but no, you need an agent, you need a lawyer, you need help. We're only one person, right? So,
yeah.
Well,
so anyway,
Phil, you did it again. You taught us all about what we need to know about immigration and the changes coming and where the future may end up. And hopefully the next time that we talk and we do a check-in with you, things have gotten themselves a little bit more smooth. Some of the mismanagements have started to get themselves managed, and the track is laid forward in a positive direction, and we keep Canada moving.
Well, we have to hope that and expect that, because the other thing that I'll talk like an old guy now is there are going to be new problems. And we need all our energy and resources and experience to deal with those new problems. We can't be continually dealing with the old problems. But you know, history has a way of teaching us that problems will always occur. We just have to keep improving the systems and try to make the problems easier to manage going forward, and try to hurt as few people as we possibly can.
Phil, we'll leave it on that note, because that was prolific and fruitful, and I feel like the audience Should be left with that, my friend. Thank you so much again.
Thank you.
Just stick around for 1 second. We'll make sure our producer's good. Everybody in the TPL atmosphere, check out TPLMedia.ca for your national podcast coverage, or check out TPLMedia.ca/local and see if your city is there. If it's not, stay tuned. It will be.
Looking for reliable and convenient personal safety products? Less Lethal has you covered. As Canada's only authorized Byrna distributor, we provide a range of products for recreation, protection, and security. Explore our Byrna launcher lineup, including the LE, SD, TCR, and Mission 4, designed for different levels of performance and protection needs. We also offer the Banshee personal safety alarm, designed to protect children, women, and vulnerable individuals. Because your safety is our top priority. Shop now at lesslethal.ca.